The rain had not stopped in days. It came down in steady sheets, soaking through uniforms, turning dirt roads into rivers of mud, and masking the sound of retreating footsteps. Major Karl Vogel stood beneath the shattered archway of what had once been a chapel, the roof now a jagged hole open to the gray sky above. The once proud village of Reichenfeld, nestled in the forested hills of southern Germany, had been reduced to rubble and smoke. Its population, both military and civilian, was dwindling by the hour. Deserters left under cover of night. Old men and wounded boys huddled in barns, too broken to flee. Karl's men, what remained of the 127th Infantry, hadn't received orders in weeks. Berlin had gone silent. The radio emitted only static and the occasional desperate broadcast from officers who sounded more like ghosts than commanders. And then the letter arrived. It came not from a courier or officer, but from an American soldier under a white flag, young, trembling, his boots caked with mud. The man emerged from the tree line with both hands raised and an envelope held out like it was a holy relic. "This is for Major Vogel," he said, his German clumsy but clear. "She said you'd understand." He handed the envelope over without another word and turned back toward the mist, vanishing into the forest. The men nearby stared at Karl, waiting, unsure if this was a message or a trap. Karl didn't open it immediately. He sat alone on a broken pew, the envelope heavy in his hand. No seal, no stamp, just his name, written in hurried pencil. He had received hundreds of messages since the war began. Orders, threats, commendations. But this one felt different. It smelled of rain and smoke and something else beneath. Familiarity. When he finally broke the seal, the handwriting hit him first. Slanted, rushed, unmistakably hers. Elise. He had not seen her in nearly 6 years, not since she was pulled from the university and forced to translate documents for the Foreign Office. A linguist, a scholar, a pacifist, her ideals had clashed violently with his world, yet she had written him once, early in the war, asking him to choose humanity over blind obedience. He had not replied. Until now, he assumed she had died like so many others, but here, in his hands, her voice returned. The note was short, almost desperate. "Karl, the unit you are holding is not what you think. Among them are people who saved me. Doctors, children, surrender. Let them go. There is nothing left to fight for. You know this. Do the right thing. E." That was all. No plea for forgiveness, no sentiment. Just a directive, quiet and piercing. Karl read it again. The enemy she spoke of must have been the American unit. His scouts reported near the woods. Retreating, wounded, boxed in. He had the means to crush them. A handful of mortars, the high ground. A plan. He had trained his men to do more with less. But now he sat still, the letter growing damp in his hands, the war louder than ever inside his skull. If what she said was true, then attacking meant killing the people who had once risked their lives for her. And for what? A village already lost? A war already over in everything but the final bullet? His adjutant entered, asking for orders. Karl didn't speak. He simply folded the letter once, slid it into his coat, and stood. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Tomorrow, they said, the Americans would breach the valley. Tomorrow, another page of history would be written in blood. But tonight, a decision waited, not for victory, but for conscience. And Karl Vogel, soldier of the Reich, felt something crack in him, not from fear, but from the memory of a voice he had once ignored. This time, he would listen. Karl didn't sleep that night. He sat alone inside the half-collapsed chapel with the letter resting beside his pistol, both equally heavy in meaning, but opposite in purpose. Outside, wind carried the low thump of distant artillery, like a dying heartbeat. His men were restless. They knew the Americans were closing in, and some were eager for one last act of defiance, others simply afraid to surrender. Morning brought no orders from high command, only silence and fog. At dawn, Lieutenant Beck entered with a report. The American unit in the forest had halted, possibly out of fuel or orders. They were boxed in, exposed, scattered, some wounded. Easy to eliminate, said Beck. Shall we prepare the mortars, Herr Major? He asked, his hand twitching slightly. Karl didn't answer. He walked past him without a word, the letter folded in his coat like a live coal. In the command post, the map still showed the Americans' position from yesterday, marked in red pencil. He stared at it for a long moment, then picked up the pencil and drew a circle around them, as if marking a grave. He gathered his officers and gave short, simple orders. Hold fire, do not engage, no patrols past the ridge. Beck looked confused. We have the advantage, sir. Karl didn't explain. He only said, not today. The men obeyed, but whispers spread. Why spare the enemy? Why now, when everything is crumbling? Some accused him of cowardice, others sensed something deeper. That afternoon, a German scout brought in a wounded American, found near the edge of the village, limping, unarmed. The man collapsed at Karl's feet and begged for help in hoarse English. Karl knelt and checked his dog tags. The name meant nothing to him. But when he searched the man's pack, he found a photograph, a group of civilians standing beside a train, and there, standing among them, barely older, was Elise, smiling, alive, proof. The scout demanded to execute the prisoner. He's a spy, a scout, a threat. Karl stood and said, he's not to be touched. He ordered the man taken to the barn, given water. That night, Karl sat by candlelight and wrote, not an order, not a report, a reply. His hand trembled as he wrote Elise's name. He told her he had seen the man, that he had ordered a ceasefire, that her words had reached him, too late for many things, but not for this. He folded the paper and sealed it with a strip of cloth. At dawn, he walked to the forest line alone, unarmed, holding the letter. He placed it under a rock where the white flag soldier had stood 2 nights before. Then he stepped back and waited. Hours passed. Nothing. But by dusk, the letter was gone. No sign of who had taken it. Only the silent woods and the distant rumble of retreating guns. That night, some of his men deserted. Others confronted him. Why don't we fight? Beck demanded. We can hold this place for days. Karl answered calmly, we're not here to win anymore. We're here to survive. The officer spat at his feet and stormed out. Karl stood alone in the courtyard, the sky dark above him. The war was ending, but the real battle, the one between orders and memory, obedience and conscience, had just begun. By the 3rd day, the ceasefire had become a silent wound across the village. The Americans had not advanced, nor had they retreated. Somewhere in the forest, they waited, perhaps uncertain, perhaps watching. Within Reichenfeld, discipline unraveled. The radio remained dead. Supplies dwindled. Morale rotted from within. Lieutenant Beck and 2 other officers confronted Karl in the chapel. They had gathered a list of names, men still loyal, men willing to strike before the Americans regrouped. Beck's voice was quiet but firm. This is mutiny prevention, he claimed. We can't sit and die here. Karl dismissed them without argument, but the line between command and collapse had grown dangerously thin. That night, under the pretense of a supply run, Beck and his faction left the village with rifles and maps. Karl knew where they were going. He issued no pursuit. He knew blood would follow. He only hoped it wouldn't fall on Elise's people. Before dawn, one of the outer lookouts reported distant gunfire in the trees. It didn't sound like a skirmish. It sounded like execution. Karl gathered the few men who still followed him and advanced toward the forest edge. They moved through mist and frost, boots crunching old leaves. The air smelled of cordite and pine. And then they saw the clearing. Bodies lay scattered, some American, some German. But what struck Karl most was the position of the corpses. Close-range shots, hands tied, weapons discarded. A massacre, not a battle. Beck had acted, ruthlessly, without orders, without reason. Among the dead was the young American soldier Karl had spared, the one with Elise's photograph. His face was turned to the sky, mouth slightly open as if still trying to speak. Karl knelt beside him and noticed something clutched in his hand, a corner of a letter, torn and bloodied, not the one Karl had written. A different one? A reply? A message? There was no way to know. He took it gently, folded it, and slipped it into his pocket. Behind him, one of his men muttered, "This was a mistake." Karl stood and faced the direction of the American camp. A flare rose suddenly from the trees, red, then green, then gone. A signal. The Americans knew what had happened, knew who had broken the silence. A new fear bloomed in Karl's chest, not of death, but of what Elise would think if she ever read the truth. Back in the village, he gathered the remaining soldiers and spoke plainly. "We will not raise weapons again. If the Americans come, we surrender. No conditions." Some nodded, others remained stone-faced, but no one argued. That night he burned his insignia, not out of shame, but to ensure no one mistook his rank for reason. He was no longer leading an army. He was simply trying to end one. At sunrise, a scout arrived breathless, holding a scrap of cloth tied to a branch, white, stained, but unmistakable. The Americans had sent it from the woods, a sign of parley. Karl knew the next step, and he knew Beck had ruined the chance for peace. But maybe, if he moved fast enough, something could still be saved. Not the war, but the last flickering pieces of what made them human. The snow came early that year, thin and gray, drifting through the trees like falling ash. Karl walked into the forest alone, unarmed, white cloth tied to a branch in his hand. Behind him, his men remained at the edge of the village, watching in silence, their weapons stacked and untouched. He followed a path barely visible under the frost, his boots sinking into soft earth, the breath in his lungs colder than fear. The flare had come from this direction, and now he waited for them to reveal themselves. Minutes passed. A voice broke the stillness. "Stop there." American accent, steady. From the shadowed grove ahead, three figures emerged, rifles lowered but ready. One of them, a captain by his stripes, approached Karl with cautious steps. "You command the Germans in Reichenfeld?" Karl nodded. "Not for long." The captain didn't smile. "We found your letter. The man who brought it is dead." "I know." Karl reached into his coat and slowly held out the torn scrap of paper he had found clenched in the young soldier's fist. "There was another message. He never finished it." The captain took it, glanced at the blood stain, then pocketed it without a word. Silence fell again. Somewhere behind the trees, more Americans waited, invisible but alert. Karl raised his hands. "We wish to surrender, unconditionally. I can give you the names of the men responsible for the attack." The captain's eyes narrowed. "What about the rest? Are they prepared to comply?" "They're done fighting. So am I." A pause. "You knew the woman who wrote the first letter?" Karl's voice was low. "I knew her before the war changed everything, before I forgot what I believed in." The captain signaled, and two of his men disappeared into the woods. Moments later, the distant clang of boots on metal signaled that they were moving, preparing, perhaps accepting, perhaps not. The Americans didn't trust easily anymore. Neither did Karl. The captain finally said, "We'll enter the village at dusk. If we're fired upon, you won't be." Karl turned and walked back through the forest, each step heavier than the one before. When he emerged, his men stared at him, searching for signs of failure or salvation. "They're coming," Karl said. "Stack your rifles. Raise no hands unless it's in surrender." They did, slowly, mechanically, like men who no longer dreamed. As the sun lowered behind the ridge, the Americans came, cautiously through the fog, their helmets pale silhouettes. No gunfire met them, no resistance, just silence and the smell of smoke from a dying village. Karl stood in the center of the courtyard as they arrived. The captain approached, gave a single nod, then turned to his men and spoke one word: "Secure." Soldiers moved through the ruins, checking, confirming, establishing control. It was over. A private handed Karl a folded blanket. Another offered a tin of water. No words, just gestures. Karl sat on a stone wall and watched them work. He expected shame. He felt only exhaustion. Elise had asked for mercy. He had given what little he had left of it, and still he had failed to protect those she cared for. Night fell. A truck pulled into the square, the back opened. A woman stepped down, wrapped in a thick coat, face obscured by a scarf. She approached the captain, whispered something, then turned toward Karl. Slowly, she lowered the scarf. Elise, alive, older. Her eyes met his, tired, searching, unreadable. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. He stood, unsure whether to bow, to apologize, to collapse. She stepped forward and placed a single folded note in his hand. From him, she said softly. He wrote it before Beck's men found us. Then she turned and walked away. Karl stood in the falling snow, the note trembling in his fingers. He opened it, breath caught. The words were brief, clumsy, scrawled in haste. Tell her I tried. Tell him he was right not to shoot me. Tell them both that some of us still believe in people. The signature was just a first name, nothing else. Karl folded it, pressed it to his chest, and sat alone as the snow erased the footprints of war. Weeks passed. The war, in all official terms, was over. Flags changed, maps redrew themselves. But in Reichenfeld, nothing truly returned to what it had been. The village remained broken, partly by shelling, mostly by memory. The American presence became routine. Patrols shifted, aid trucks arrived. One day, a priest came to reopen the chapel. Another, a photographer, took pictures of the surrender site. No one asked Karl to smile. He never would have. He had been placed under observation, not arrested, not cleared, a kind of limbo. The Americans didn't know what to do with a man who had stopped obeying just before it no longer mattered. He stayed in a small room above what had once been a bakery. Each morning, he walked the same path, to the edge of the forest where the letter had been delivered. He stood there for minutes, sometimes hours, waiting for something he couldn't name. Closure, maybe, or punishment. Elise never returned to the village. She had left with the Americans days after the surrender. She didn't leave another message. Only the folded reply from the young soldier remained, pressed between pages of a burnt field manual on Karl's table. He read it every night, tracing the words like Braille. Tell her I tried. Tell him he was right. Tell them someone still believed. It became his prayer. No medals had ever meant so much. One afternoon, an American officer handed Karl a sealed envelope. She asked me to give this to you if you were still here. He opened it slowly, her handwriting again. I'm not coming back. You made a choice. That matters. He forgave you. Maybe that's enough. Take care of the place. That's all that's left now. There was no signature, just a pressed flower between the pages, a wild violet, dried and brittle. It must have been picked near the clearing, a place where one war ended quietly. In the months that followed, Karl began to fix the chapel. Not for sermons, there were no parishioners, but because it gave his hands something to do. He cleared glass, rebuilt the frame, propped up the wall with beams from a collapsed barn. The soldiers didn't interfere. One even helped him carry bricks. Nobody called him Major anymore. Just him or the old man. He didn't correct them. One morning, children arrived from the next town, orphans mostly, following a relief unit. One of them peeked into the chapel and asked, "Was this where the war stopped?" Karl looked up from his work and said, "No, but it's where someone decided not to make it worse." The boy didn't understand. He didn't need to. Years later, the official histories would not mention Reichenfeld. No battles, no victories, no treaties, just a footnote. But someone, somewhere, would remember that a unit went silent when they could have fired, that a letter crossed enemy lines and changed a man, that one final decision, without orders, without glory, might have saved lives. Karl Vogel died in 1953 in that same village, no rank carved on his stone, just his name and the words etched below by a hand Elise once held. He listened